afternoon. We're going to kick this off. I think we also are streaming live on YouTube, which might be my main voyage on there as far as YouTube Live goes. But I'm Josh Brown. I was part of the facilities task force that met throughout, I guess it would have been last year at this point. So I also am prior chairman of the board of the chamber, work here locally at Bell Insurance. So Terry asked me if I would say a few words in regards to kind of the task force work that went into the process that led us to where we are today. So I'm just going to run through a few slides of what kind of we did and what we saw, and then I'm going to turn it over to Terry to kind of keep it going. So we met as a task force starting last March. Probably the most unfortunate piece about that was the timing of it and the pandemic, that we had one meeting in person, actually I think around the day that things kind of started getting a little wonky. So the process was supposed to not be as lengthy of a process from a time standpoint, but it turned out to be a little longer than maybe we all had anticipated going in. So we ended up having 23 meetings from March through December, put in a bunch of hours and time, went through and did a whole lot of different things, from having conversations about what does education of the future look like, how are teaching methods the same or different as we look forward into the future, classroom setup, all that kind of stuff. I consider myself probably on the younger side, and a lot of this stuff was new to me. You know, still the traditional classroom, sit in chairs, look at a whiteboard. And I have children in the system, and knowing full well that that's not exactly how things operate anymore. So it was interesting to kind of get that perspective of where that's going and kind of what that might look like in the future. So we did a lot of conversation about that. We then did a touring of a number of the schools to look at the current conditions of the schools and areas that needed improvement and those kind of things. I wasn't able to be involved in all of the tours, as they were throughout the summer, and I coach baseball for my son's team. So, but in the tours that I was able to go to, you can definitely know and tell pretty quickly that there are things that need to be fixed and maintained, and some of that kind of stuff. And then we also talked a lot about, you know, how does the school funding process work, referendums, what does that mean, when was the last time Grand Forks had one versus when was the last time other communities that we may compare ourselves have had referendums, and some of those kind of things, and just different ways of how do we get our school district to the point that we need it to be. So as we went through and did all that and really talked about and looked at a lot of the stuff, you know, it was pretty blatantly obvious relatively quickly that there was a lot of work that needed to be done, and it wasn't going to be kind of a quick and easy fix. So a little bit on the makeup of the group that we had as part of the task force. So there were, I'm going to totally mess up the number, but I think we started with somewhere around 40 or 50 task members that kind of represented a lot of different factors throughout the community, different areas of the community, different backgrounds, all of those kind of things. So we all came to the task force with different ideas and thoughts and all of that kind of thing. And probably one of the biggest things that I came to the task force with was, one, I wanted to have an open mind to see what was going on and what the real picture was. But my leaning is always towards, you know, let's tax as little as possible kind of mindset, right? But really when we went into it and we started to get into the nitty-gritty, so to speak, it became really clear that that was going to be a difficult thing to do as far as keeping that down to ultimately get us to kind of where we needed to be. So I think when you look at the slide that's up there right now, the one that the bullet point that I circled as far as what we all agreed on was that there was definitely, again, and it was pretty dang apparent that there were some significant changes that had to happen. So it didn't take long for us to realize that there was definitely things that needed to happen in kind of a large way. So then, as we went through that and started having conversations, and actually as and Terry and I were talking a little bit about before we kicked off the meeting here, it was pretty far down the meeting process of when we started to talk about, you know, what does a potential solution look like after we had gone through, what do the buildings look like, what does teaching look like, what do the numbers look like as far as maintenance and some of those kind of things that need to be done on the current buildings. And throughout those conversations, it was interesting to me that this thought or this idea of having a school that was essentially K through 8, whether there's some sort of kind of dividing line, so to speak, within the building or not, it wasn't really something that I don't know that much, if any, task force members had thought about. But as we started to explore the different ideas and the different ways of how do we resolve the problems that we're seeing and make the fixes that we need to make, this quickly became kind of rose to the top as far as the best solution to get the district to where it needed to be. So not only that, there was a couple other pieces that as I went through this process as being a task force member that really stood out to me. One of the other pieces outside of the big referendum number that we're talking about here for June is that additional 10 mills in the building fund. To me, as we've looked at the numbers and gone through this, if we don't have that as part of this process, everything else that's being done 25 years from now could be a moot point. So that 10 mills additional on the building fund to me is just as important as the referendum side of it to really be able to maintain the facilities that we have. One of the things one of the terms that I used kind of throughout the process, and Scott probably got annoyed with me saying it so many times, but that we need to make sure that when we solve this problem, that we're essentially funding our depreciation going forward so that we don't end up back here having the same conversation 25 years from now. So as you look at this and as Terry kind of goes through his presentation, you know, maybe keep that in mind as, you know, where we really need to go and how do we keep ourselves from having this conversation again in the not so distant future. So with that, I'll turn it over to Terry to kind of walk you guys through the rest of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Josh. Terry Brenner, Superintendent, Grand Forks Public Schools and Grand Forks Air Force Base School Districts. First of all, I want to thank all of you for being here today or joining us online so you can capture the essence of where we're at with all of our pre-referendum work and everything that we're doing leading up to June 22nd. I want to thank Keith Lund from the EDC and Barry Wolfert from the Chamber for orchestrating this and pulling this off in just a matter of a couple of weeks. So we're very grateful that you're here. And two things that I want to make sure that all of you hear on the front end and on the tail end. Should this referendum pass on June 22nd, there's going to be ample work for all of you, from architects to HVAC, engineering, plumbing, heating, and all the other acronyms that I don't know. There's going to be plenty of work for all of you locally. And we want to make sure that money stays locally. So I want to make sure you hear that at the beginning, and I also want to make sure you hear that at the end. So following up on what Josh said, and hats off to Josh and the Facilities Task Force, I think 60 hours and 23 meetings is maybe a little bit under the standard of which they worked. It's probably more like 70 or 80 hours. And some of those task force members continue to come to school board meetings to make sure that that conversation is moving forward with the integrity and the intent that it was handed off by that Facilities Task Force. So we're very grateful for Josh and all of the task force members for the incredible work that they did. So we've been engaging in workshopping or work sessions with the school board. We actually had 4 of those between January and March, reviewing the recommendations from the task force and made some preliminary decisions, and then really refined those decisions to the point where it was acceptable for all 9 school board members. We also distributed a community-wide survey. We had about 1,500 people respond to that. Some people might be critical that that's not a large piece, but nonetheless, it is a piece of what the public is telling us about this referendum. regardless of zip code here in Grand Forks, we still have a little bit of an idea about what people think about an $86 million ask attached to that referendum, and also with a 10 mil increase in our building fund. I also want to share with you that, this isn't the first time we've had this conversation. I've been in the school district for 26 years. It's my third year in the position as superintendent. But if you just look at this timeline, we've had lots of people come in and out of our school district as consultants, giving us feedback relative to where our schools are, what we should do with our schools. We've had demographer working with us on a regular basis, on an annual basis, helping us understand where growth is in our community, where growth is stagnant in our community, and where our buildings are. And sometimes there's a little bit of a disconnect where the people are and where the buildings are. And we'll get more into that a few slides later. But as you can see, lots of studies have been done, and there have been recommendations made in the past. And usually what it comes down to is timing. Is this the right time to make these kind of major overhaul changes within the school district? And based on my experience or my experience away from that experience, it wasn't the right time for the community to have those conversations. But interestingly, I ran into our former school district business manager who was here in the mid-'80s. And some of these very same conversations were happening at that time as well, conversations that you'll see in forthcoming slides. So in 1997, we did a major upgrade with lots of our facilities based on the water that came through our community. We did more than $80 million worth of construction and reconstruction and repurposing of our buildings due to the flood of 1997. All of that was realized through FEMA. All of that with the exception of about $300,000. That's what it cost for new furnaces, new interior, new carpeting, new everything. And I happened to be the principal at Wilder at the time, where the waters came moving through that building. And we literally gutted that school and were able to redesign it based upon what learning environments look like at that time, or what we were predicting learning environments to look like even into the future. So everything kind of looked new then. New boilers, new everything. But here we are 24 years later, and we've had boilers fail. We've had other colossal infrastructure failures that has cost us cash. Cash coming out of the general fund that really is used for our operating expenses, general fund not meaning to be used for building or capital investments. And so what we have in this, the second question on the ballot about increasing our mills from 10 to 20, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but if I say it twice, it might register with some of you before you leave. If we can move our 10 mil to 20 mills, that would be a $2.5 million increase into our building fund. That would help us with capital improvements. That would help us with deferred maintenance, with ongoing projects. Right now, the 10 mills generates about $2.5 million, and that covers our debt, basically. Not even quite, as Mr. Berge would look at me, our business manager, and say, not quite, Terry. So we have some opportunities. We had some opportunities back in 2008 when we received some stimulus dollars, and we were able to do some upgrades, window replacements at Central High School. That was probably one of the larger projects, multi-million-dollar project. And then we had some school construction fund bonds that we're able to use for Discovery Elementary back in 2014. And now we're seeing some cash come our way relative to the pandemic. Right now we're in our second round of ESSER funds coming our way. We received about $2.2 million at the beginning of the summer. We were able to upgrade all of our technology, our infrastructure, so it got us off to a really good place from a remote learning environment with our virtual academy, with students moving between school and home. So we're very well prepared for our school year this year. Then the second round has made its way to the state, but those monies have not been released to us yet. And then there'll be a third round of ESSER funds. So round 2 is about $8.2 million, round 3 is $18.5 million, and 20% of that money needs to be used to close the learning gap or the learning loss from this pandemic. So we have opportunities because some of these funds can be used for school improvements, and we're going to make sure we take advantage of that and provide tax relief wherever we might be able to. So here's just a quick snapshot of the ages of our buildings. And I don't think this is anything new for all of you. Some of you have been in our facility, some of you have worked in our facilities. But you can see our average age is around 55, 60 years old of all of our campuses. And then we'll talk about enrollment at each of these campuses and what that means relative to, do we have enough square footage, too many square feet, or simply not enough. And here we go with the square feet piece. So if you look at Wilder on the left, that's one of our neighborhood schools on the north end. And it has space, but it also, really what this slide tells you is the larger the space is under one roof, the more efficient we can be. Not only from and I want to make clear, not just from a financial standpoint, but from a teaching and learning and practitioner standpoint. When we have single isolated classrooms, one first grade, one second grade, one third grade, it's really hard to control class size. And our school board and district administration has been really proud of our smaller number class sizes. But when we get into a small school, those numbers can really accentuate. We could have a classroom of 12, we could have a classroom of 29. And so if we have more classrooms under one roof, that gives us more flexibility to create those classroom spaces. And then there's a cost, total square feet versus utility cost per square foot. And you can see the larger the building, and what I'm not advocating for is a school of 1,000. That's not what anybody is advocating for. But when we get into schools that have 3 to 4 sections, and I'm talking about elementary schools right now, that's where you can really capture those professional and economic learning efficiencies when we get into schools that size. You can see when we have smaller schools, it means more transient staff, more shared staff. Sometimes we have families who move in and move out, and that does create some challenges from a staffing perspective. So if you can imagine a PE teacher, a music teacher, a world language teacher, library, media specialist, a lot of those people in our small schools have to move from school to school. And so then we have to create gaps in their schedule to make sure that they have travel time. And that costs money to do that. So we can simply be more efficient when we can get more people under one roof. So a bit of a follow-up to what Josh said. This work really has been around conversations around our aging buildings, infrastructure, some of the catastrophic failures we've had. We've had to move between $9 and $12 million out of our general fund just over the last several years to make sure we could have heat on in a building, to make sure we can have air conditioning on in a building. And that's where those mills will really be critical for us moving forward. So we have aging HVAC systems. We have some obsolete control systems. I know that even in this building, the older part of this building, sometimes teachers will take a wet rag and put it on their thermostat so they can either get heat or get less heat. They try to trick the thermostat, and that's not a really efficient way to run a building this size. So you can see we have some inefficiencies that way. Just the physical features, particularly some of the exterior features of our buildings, we're finding in difficult shape. And some of the IEP requirements, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, because when you heard me say our buildings are like 55 to 60 years old on average, these buildings were built before special education was even a concept. Special education came around in 1973, 1974 with 13 categories, and then we have Section 504 of the law that is a provision that makes sure we make accommodations and adaptations for students who don't even qualify for an IEP. This means space. This means unique space. It can't always be the same 4 classroom walls that would be accommodating for a specific group of students. We have medically fragile students. We have students with us who are at end of life, who spend their final days with us. We need to make sure that we have spaces that provide dignity and integrity for those students and staff who work with those kids, our kids. And I want to make sure that that's a real clear point. These are all of our students who come to us every day. And we don't turn anybody away at our front doors. So total general fund expenditure per pupil, sometimes this is a dangerous area for me to go in. This is actually Scott Berge, our business manager's wheelhouse. But he's really put together some compelling information that shows when you have more physical spaces that aren't efficient, it really costs the district a lot more money to run these spaces. And when you compare us to other school districts, we like to compare, you know, always in the Big Five: Bismarck, Fargo, West Fargo, Grand Forks, and Minot. We're pretty similar, really, culturally, diversity-wide. Minot has an Air Force base. We have an Air Force base. Theirs is much bigger than ours is now, but it's pretty similar in student enrollment. But you can see, you know, the cost for us to educate one student is $14,267. Minot is not too far behind. Fargo not too far behind. And that's pretty much how much we spend on each student. That's not the amount that we receive from the state. The state per pupil foundation aid payment is a little more than $10,000, and after all the equalization of local tax and everything, it's a little more than $8,000. So you can kind of see the disconnect with our revenue stream and our expenditure stream. If you look on the other side of this slide, teacher and support staff salaries and benefits per pupil, this is a telling slide as well. We employ more adults per student than the other large school districts. That's something that we're trying to reconcile through a budget reduction exercise right now, which has been a very painful process because it involves people. But at the same time, we have to really take a good hard look at decreasing our expenditures while we're going to the public asking for support. This is just a quick slide on all of the categories that we're looking at as it relates to our facilities, so I won't spend too much time on this. And just so everybody knows, this is being recorded and will be archived and uploaded on our website, so you can certainly go back and take a look. So this is a very busy slide, but it's a compelling and storytelling slide. When it talks about the ages of our buildings and the life expectancy of the infrastructure of those buildings, most of our infrastructure has really outlived its lifespan. And that's thanks to our HVAC people and our electricians, you know, who do this work on a daily basis, who keep some of our buildings limping along, and really do remarkable work. If you'd ever been in the tunnels of Valley Middle School, or if you've been in Valley Middle School in August or late May, some of the classrooms there are 94 degrees with or without humidity. And if you go in the tunnels and you look at the pipes that is carrying either steam or air quality or lack of air quality, you'd be amazed at how those pipes are being held together. They're the original infrastructure of that building. So our facilities task force folks were able to see those pipes. Some of those pipes were pulled out and demonstrated and, you know, shown the dimension of, you know, here's a 6-inch pipe, but here's really the space that water has to go through that pipe. So this is a slide that kind of tells that story, that it's remarkable, absolutely remarkable, that some of our buildings are still performing at the level that they are performing given their age. We have unit ventilators. They can be noisy heating systems per classroom. As a matter of fact, we had a school board meeting, Grand Forks Air Force Base school board meeting here a few weeks ago, and we did it by Zoom, and our base board president was substitute teaching at Twining on the base that day, and there was this constant knock in the background. She happened to be in a classroom with a ventilator that was making that knocking sound. You can't even get parts for these things anymore. So if you think about the quality of air moving in those rooms or the lack thereof, it's concerning for all of us. This also depicts, gives you an idea of all of our schools, and we'll just start with our high schools and middle schools. And SiteLogic is a third-party neutral vendor who's been working with us for well over a year on putting together this information, so it's shareable and understandable. But this kind of tells you the story of each of our schools, you know, relative to the danger zone that the school might be in as far as needing some sort of attention. So if you look at Schrader Middle School on 32nd Avenue South, about a fourth of the pie is acceptable, but there's alarm, alert, and caution. So a major part of that building needs some attention. South, we'd like to say one of our newer schools, built in 98 after the flood, 98, 99. Even though it's still relatively new, there's quite a caution area and quite an alert area. Valley Middle School, you can see just very little, what's left of that pie is acceptable. And the facility task force kind of worked through a metric that, once a building gets beyond a certain investment, it's not worth investing anymore, but it is worth rebuilding on that site. And then you can see Central and Red River. Central, I think people forget how old Central High School is, but we're on year 104, with some modern additions, made back in the mid-1980s. And that's a remarkable jewel for downtown. Some people like to call it the crown jewel. Some people like it to call it the queen, and many people refer it to her or she. But nonetheless, she is a beautiful campus. Red River, our newer high school, which is now more than 50 years old, other than the space that you're sitting in today, certainly has some areas that need to be addressed. And here are our elementary schools. I'll just highlight Discovery because that would be our newest building, 7 years old. And you can see already that there's some deferred maintenance that we need to pay attention to so we don't get into, as Josh said, this situation today with Discovery 30 or 40 years from now. So we really need those extra 10 mils so we can reinvest in our schools, and we really, the referendum is going to be a really critical piece for us moving forward so we can really catch up with some of this deferred maintenance. So just a few minutes ago, I talked about where the buildings are and where the people are. This is what we refer to as a heat map. This is our demographer who puts together this information. So if you just look at the top of this map, that would be the north end of Grand Forks. And that red E, that would be Wilder Elementary School. And the blue H would be Central High School. And the yellow E right below Wilder would be Winship. And then you've got Valley Middle School to the left and West Elementary School. And then you go further to the left and you have Lake Agassiz. So where you see the red coloring on the map, that's where the people are. If you see where the circles are, that's where the buildings are. And the color code for the building, really talks about what kind of investment each of those buildings need. So this is one of the pieces relative to the task force's work, how they got to the recommendation that they came to. So if you just look at that northern tier, not a lot of red there regarding people, but we have a few campuses there where it might just make sense to consolidate those campuses into one K-8 facility and to get all of those students under one roof, depending on how that's designed, right? There's more to come on that. So you can see if you continue to go south, the red gets a little more dense. It gets dense in Midtown, and it actually gets dense in that Bringwatt Park area, which is kind of interesting because we don't have a school there. But nonetheless, there are lots of people in that area. But those people, you can see down on the bottom, we've got an elementary school, that would be Discovery, and then we have South Middle School. So there certainly has been discussion about, do we need a new campus on the south end? Maybe at some point in the future, but I think it's important for us to invest where our infrastructure is and where we know we still have existing people and how we can help refurbish and redevelop and renew some neighborhoods. Here are some of the categories that the task force spent time on, and also district administration did. You can see HVAC and indoor air quality are a couple big ticket items for us. The pandemic has really highlighted indoor air quality for us. It wasn't uncommon to have windows open periodically throughout the winter just to get some fresh air into our campuses. And so whatever we can do to move some fresh air into our campuses would be greatly appreciated through the referendum. Learning environments, I already talked about this, talking about all kids come to our school programmatically. We deliver for every single student who comes to us. And if there's one thing that I've learned about the Discovery Elementary project, inadvertently learned, was just walking through that building in January or February and not seeing a crappy person during that time. Just all the natural lighting that comes into that campus, it's just amazing. Now that doesn't mean we can get natural lighting like that in all of our campuses, but I think with some upgrades we can certainly improve that. Equity is a large focus. It was a large focus for the task force. It shouldn't matter if your zip code is 203 or 201 in this community. Every kid, every learner, and every teacher and every staff member should have an equal opportunity to do their work and to do their learning. Safety and security was also another component, and that's a component of the referendum ask. And I don't think I need to say anything to anybody in this room about security and safety at the school level. And then finally, in the left-hand corner, just infrastructure and building systems. We've got asbestos in many of our campuses, so that would need to be abated moving forward. Sprinkler systems, just upgrading all of our mechanical systems. When we went through West Elementary, when we had that really wet fall, the fall of 2019, and we had all that rain, I was taking a look at some of our campuses over the weekend, and went to West Elementary School, which is a garden level view, and where their electrical box was in their furnace room, that's where all the water was coming in. So probably made sense 70 years ago when the building was constructed, but certainly didn't make sense when I was standing in a half a foot of water, wondering if I should touch that electrical box or not, which I didn't, which is why I'm still here today. Just trying to offer a little bit of humor for this quiet audience. All right. By the way, there'll be a Q&A session at the end, and we would ask you to come up to the microphone since we are recording this and broadcasting this live. We just ask you to come to this microphone, ask your question, and either Scott Berge or I hopefully can answer that question. Here's another telling feature of revenue versus expenditures. Several years ago, the state took over a majority of K through 12 per pupil funding, and we were ecstatic about that. But as oil goes, so do payments to school districts. So just a couple of areas I want to highlight for you here: 2017, 2018, 2019 static funding, and looking at what might be coming out of the legislature this go around could be static funding again. So we could have 4 to 6 years of no increases while our costs continue to go up each year, which is another reason why we're in a budget reduction exercise. So the funding formula for K-12 education hasn't even kept pace with Social Security. I want you to just think about that. You don't have to do anything with it. I just want you to think about that. So here are our sources of funding. We get a small pie, just a little bit under $10 million from federal government. That would be Title I, Title II, Title IV, Title VI types of dollars. Those are federal programs. Title I is probably our largest one. That supports some of our economically disadvantaged schools, families. From a socioeconomic perspective, we can supplement teaching and learning environments with more staff, providing more services, getting a wider net around those communities. And then at the local level, it's about $27 million, and from the state, it's about $66 million. And I think important to note at this point is about 85 to 87% of our expenditures are tied to people. So we've taken that final 13% and we've squeezed every last bit of juice out of that. So that's why we're now talking about people in programs without destroying the integrity of the programs that provide services for students. This is just a better snapshot of the previous slide. This shows that funding has been pretty flat coming into the school district. And I want to be really cautious how I say that, because we have a wonderful relationship with our legislators who work with us on bills, whether it's funding or homeschooling, whatever it might be. They're terrific to work with. But when you get a collective body in Bismarck, sometimes it's really hard to move that needle. Frankly, there are people in Bismarck who think schools are overpaid, and they should figure out how to do more with less. So the property tax piece, you can see back in, from 2015 all the way through 2018, we could ride a little of that wave in terms of revenue, but it's been pretty flat since then. And since our mills are capped, the revenue that's generated through increase in home values, we're not seeing a lot of that. And, that has a ripple effect across the community as well. Here's our building and sinking fund mill levy comparison. I've talked about the 10 mills that we have that takes care of our payments or barely takes care of our payments. Scott would probably have to correct me because we've got 12 on the slide here. There's probably a little nuance difference there, right, Scott? But just comparing to our other counterparts, you can see how many mills they're able to levy. And one of the really telling pieces, you know, Scott has really drilled down to, this isn't about large community, smaller community. This is about how much it costs to educate each kid, or how much revenue is generated on a $250,000 home from a school property tax perspective in Fargo compared to Devil's Lake, compared to Grand Forks, compared to Minot, compared to Bismarck. And we're always on the lower end of that. So Scott likes to say, gee, you know, if we had the collection agency that Fargo has, we wouldn't even be having this conversation today. We would have enough cash flow to do the work that we do need to do. And this is the scariest part. Probably as your superintendent, I certainly don't want to be the superintendent that breaks the bank. But you can see where our general fund was in 2014, and you can see the projected fund balance June 30th, 2021. And generally speaking, you know, 15% of your overall budget is a good carryover amount. Some people say 10, some people say 20. We'd be happy with 10% at this point. But where all that money has gone is into new boilers in many of our buildings where we've had those catastrophic failures. I alluded to the 9 to 11 million that we've taken out of this fund for capital projects so we could keep buildings open. So another reason why we're undergoing the budget reduction exercise. And really that 5 million that you see at the end of June, that gives us about 2 weeks of operating expenses. And I don't think anybody in this room would operate his or her checkbook that way. But we had no choice. We had to put new boilers in Central, in Phoenix, in Schrader, South, to keep those buildings open for learning. So the building fund mill levy facts. I'll just walk you through this slide. We can be authorized to go to the voters for up to 20 mills. Presently we have 10. Local taxpayers would need to approve that. So that would be the second question on the ballot this summer. 10 additional mills, as stated earlier, would be an additional 2.5 million into our building fund. And we're authorized at 10. And what I should do, I probably should back up at this point and say, excuse me, at one point we were levying 20 mills from a school district perspective. And that was challenged by a local taxpayer. It went all the way to the Supreme Court. The school district lost, so we had to move from 20 to 10. And so that would have been about 10 years ago. So you multiply 10 years by 2.5 million a year, and that was a lot of cash that we lost to do capital projects. And then you can see the final bullet. The other large school districts all have 20 mills. Sometimes this slide offends people, and that's not the intent. That's not to have the city council folks be upset with us, or the county commissioners or the park district. But if you just look at the pie of where your local tax dollars go, you know, we're pretty proud of the fact that Grand Forks Public School District, compared to the other school districts, the large ones, has the smallest piece of the local tax pie at 31%. You can see West Fargo's at 46, Bismarck 46, Minot 40, and Fargo 53. There's really nothing we can do about changing that pie other than asking the voters if they'd be willing to pay more. Here are just a few pictures from the inside of some of our buildings. You can see where we got wood frame rotting. The picture in the right-hand corner is one of those classroom ventilators, heat ventilators, and you can see the old thermostat on the wall. What you see in the bottom left-hand corner is the skylight at Central High School that is in need of repair. Red River, we just spent a considerable amount of money on the skylight in the cafeteria as well, just because of leaks that happen over the course of 50 years. And then you can see this electrical box in the bottom right-hand corner, and that's one of those boxes that was down in the lower level where water tends to come in to a facility. Again, I don't want you to walk away with the perception that this is what all of our buildings look like, but this is what our facilities task force folks were able to see during their school tours. Not too many people get to see the guts or the interior of our buildings. And a large part of that is we have a terrific custodial staff across this district. So when parents and community members walk into our buildings, they look pretty darn nice on the inside. It's just when you peel back the carpet or you get in the tunnels or you get down into the boiler room, then you can really see where we have some work to do. So here's a property tax example. That's really what people want to know. What is this going to cost? And Scott, this one I might have you come up and explain, if you wouldn't mind doing that. If you want to just come up and take this slide, and then I can toggle back, because I was thinking this was a different slide. Sorry to put you on the spot like that, especially on live stream.
Well, you know me, I love spreadsheets, so I'm very happy to explain this slide. What we're seeing here is Grand Forks Public Schools levies 101 mills, and so this is the current calculation, and the calculation for the mill levy is the same across the state. And so you take the market value times 50%, and then the residential ratio is 9% of that 1/2. And that's how we determine the taxable valuation of the property. And then we take that times the 101 mills, and then you divide that by 1,000 to get to that mill levy value. So on a $100,000, say there's a residential home in Grand Forks that's taxable, or the market value is $100,000, the school district property tax would total $454.50. And so if you break that down from the 101 mills, each individual mill equates to $4.50 on $100,000 of property value. And so this the $4.50 that basically that that works towards the calculations that we will discuss later with the $86 million referendum ask, as well as the increase of the building fund from 10 mills to 20 mills. So it's $4.50 per 100,000. Commercial property is taxed at, or the ratio for commercial property is 10% versus the 9%. And in calculations that we've done, we've calculated residential, commercial, and also ag land based on acreage. And so we've calculated all of those components. I hope that helps. Thanks.
Probably should have kept you up here just for another slide, but I think it's self-explanatory. But we can certainly toggle back to this if there are any questions toward the end on property tax and what that will mean for you, particularly if you're commercial. We might be able to answer that question. And we already talked about the heat map, and that's just where the students are and where the buildings are. And this is what I alluded to early on in the presentation when we talked about some of our smaller campuses having classrooms of fewer than 15 students versus having class sizes of 16 to 20. K through 3, we like to be in that 18 to 1 ratio. Give or take a student here or there. Sometimes it works out perfectly depending on the campus, and sometimes it doesn't. So you can see just from last year, 2019-2020, the number of classes that had fewer than 15 students, and again, this is elementary, not middle or high school. We had 10 classes like that. So you can see, how things are trending. If you go all the way back to 2013, 2014, we only had 3 or 4 classrooms at that size. So it just puts us from a master scheduling perspective, a staffing perspective, it creates some challenges for us. So we actually, back to the slide where we employ more people per kid than any other large school district, this speaks to that. So part of our strategic plan that we recently rebooted and identified new goals and new strategies in new priority areas. One of those is long-term resource planning, and that resource planning has to do with facilities as well. So we've asked this question: where are we at today? Where do we want to be? And how do we get there? And part of how we get there is by starting community conversations with you today. We certainly have started similar conversations like this in the past. As a matter of fact, the fall of 2019, we had some neighborhood meetings. They were very lightly attended. That's no fault of anybody's. There just wasn't a lot of interest because we really weren't talking about specific schools or what we might be doing with specific schools into the future. But once we started talking about buildings, how we might consolidate, how we might be more efficient, that has certainly drawn more public interest, and we're happy that it has drawn that type of interest. So in all of our planning, we talk about the physical needs of our facilities. What kind of quality environment do we want? Safety and security, we've talked about that. We want to optimize our energy from a real efficient standpoint. Educational needs, already talked about that. We're 21 years beyond 21st century. So that's an old mantra right now. We really need to be positioning ourselves for 2050. And so, as Josh said earlier, so we're not in this next generation, we're not having the same conversation about how did we get here. And I certainly don't want the next facility task force to be looking back saying, well, that task force handed off a terrific recommendation, but central administration didn't do a very good job of delivering it. So I want to be with you, part of the solution moving forward. And then just, functional needs as we look at repurposing some of our buildings. How can they be used from a community perspective? I know when we built Discovery, we spent a lot of time on talking about the Library Media Center. We spent a lot of time about access and community. And at the same time, we're dealing with violence across the country and violence happening on our school campuses. So unfortunately, we've had to make these more closed than open. And how they're designed and how they're constructed is really around the safety of students and staff. So as a matter of fact, 2 years ago, I was at the National School Boards Convention and listened to a couple of architects and their recent buildings in a couple of different states. And there was a K-8 campus that was built, and it almost looked like a minty pentagon. It was built like a fortress, and in the middle of that fortress was the playground. There was no playground on the exterior of that building. And in every classroom, at the back of every classroom, there was a door, and it looked like a coat room or a backpack room, and that's what it served its purpose for most of the time. But it was also solid concrete, and it was also their safety room in case they needed to go in there into lockdown. That's just the way of how we think about schools moving forward, unfortunately. So the budget sustainability piece, and we're getting towards the final end here, so bear with me, is really to align our expenditures with what our strategic initiatives are. And we're focusing on academics, comprehensive school mental health systems, or a system that we want to have in place. We've been able to bring more people into our environment that work with our students from a mental health perspective based on granting dollars, not necessarily based on district or general fund dollars. And there's just more programming that is necessary for students with mental health needs. And some of you have heard me say this before, so forgive me. 7, 8 years ago, we would say if a student didn't know how to read, nothing else mattered. And now what we're saying today is if a student doesn't know how to socially, emotionally, or behaviorally regulate him or herself, nothing else matters. That's our top priority when our kids come to us. That's the state of our country, that's the state of our state, and that's the state of our school district. I talked a little bit about our budget reduction exercise. It's going to be a 10% reduction over the course of 2 years. So 10% of 108 million, you can do the math. And right now we're presenting to the board 4.5 million in reductions moving into next year. And we hope to balance that budget. Hope is not the right word. We will balance the budget by July 1 of 2022, and then start to begin to grow that general fund in 2023. A referendum will help that. A referendum is not the answer to that. We know there's some things internally that we need to do to reconcile our budget. So the referendum ask is an $86 million bond. And the purpose for that would be to invest $70.5 million in a new K-8 campus on the present Valley Middle School site. We have ample green space there where we could build on one side of Valley. We could keep all students and staff at their present buildings until that building is completed, and then we would raise the old Valley, and then we would just flip-flop the fields, the softball fields, the football fields, et cetera. That would be, you know, when you see annual operating return on investment of $750,000, that's a low number. Most of us believe it's going to be double that when we take 4 campuses and consolidate into one. I know there's been conversation about equity and transportation, and you know, are we disadvantaging some of our neighborhoods? And that's a fair question, and that's a question that we as a district and as a school board will need to wrestle with to make sure that there is equity in terms of getting kids to and from school. So if we do nothing, we'll still have, you know, $47 million plus in deferred maintenance on those 4 campuses. So there's really a nice slide that shows if we make the investment, and I give credit to Dean Kuhn on that one of our facility task force members who's here in the audience. Thank you for being here today, Dean. If we pass a referendum, the difference between passing a referendum and spending money on all the necessary things that needs to be done, and if we do nothing, the total's not too far apart in millions. So it's kind of a nice snapshot of why we really need to do this. I already talked about special education learning environments and security enhancements. So the tax impact for that, and I'm going to say this is on a $100,000 house, would be $7.99 a month, and the 10 mil building fund increase would be $3.75 a month. We've been using the metric on a $250,000 house, but it just seems easier to use 100,000, and then you can aggregate that up doing your own math. So on a $100,000 house, you know, about $12 a month is what it would cost to get all this work done. There will also be an energy savings project, and this will be actually cash that doesn't need to come in and out of our books. Those of you who live in this world know this better than I do, but these are some of the programs that we can do to capture about $8.5 million in savings. That we wouldn't have to balance that on the backs of taxpayers. And then how we use the ESSER funds that I've already alluded to, ESSER funds 1, 2, and 3, you can see that we have some opportunities to offset some other costs moving forward as well. What we don't know about the ESSER funds, we get mixed messages. There hasn't been anything concrete yet. Can those be new? Can those be used for new construction? Can HVAC in a new K-8 campus be paid for with ESSER funds? We don't know the answer to that yet. And should we have a successful referendum on June 22nd, this is what I wanted you to hear for a second time today. There'll be plenty of work locally for architects, engineers, HVAC, electrical, plumbing, and just everything else that happens when money exchanges hands at the local level. And then if you want any more information, you can go to our website. We have a referendum tab that you can click on and access lots of different information. Our communications coordinator, along with some of the work that we've done with SiteLogic, are ready to launch lots of our information here yet this week. So it's going to become a lot more public, but we wanted to have a little more intimate conversation with our business leaders today. So with that was a lot of information in 54 minutes. I know we're designed to be here till 5:30, but nobody's going to hold you to that. But Scott and I would be more than pleased to respond to any questions, concerns, have you thought of, whatever might be on your mind. We'd ask you to come up to the microphone and ask a question or two. Thank you, Keith.
Scott, thank you for being here and providing this overview for the business community. We've said it before that having a vibrant, healthy, high-performing education system is really key to having a vibrant community and really impactful for what I do and so many do in terms of building this community. You touched on this a little bit, but I wanted to ask a question. I think it's more for you, Superintendent. You know, I think we can all appreciate, you know, deferred maintenance and needing to replace some things. Can you touch a little bit more on any expected educational outcomes that you might expect as a result of this investment that you hope to secure from voters? And also, even more importantly, maybe for this audience specifically, how that can be impactful in terms of workforce preparation, in terms of connecting students to career opportunities in the region.
Thank you for that question, Keith. Anytime that we can have more educators under one roof than not is a good thing. Some of you are parents, and you know we have early dismissals almost every other Wednesday. We have 2 to 2.5 hours, a block of time for our professional learning communities and for our multi-tiered support system conversations. And basically, that time is used to identify goals and objectives for the next 2 weeks for many of our students. It looks a little differently at the elementary level, middle, and high school, where they get more into departments. But what I can say is, you know, for my 4th grade son, on any given Wednesday, there's going to be a new academic goal written for him, and it's going to be a stretch goal, and that will be measured in the next 2 weeks or the next month, whatever, you know, the teaching team decides to do. So it really speaks to laser-like focus on instruction. And you know, we've also really committed, all of our staffs collectively across the district have committed to what effective instruction looks like. I won't get into all the nuances and the details of what that means for you, but commitment statements about what should we see in every classroom as it relates to effective instruction. What should we sometimes see, and what should we never see? And some of us are old enough to know some of that, what we should never see, happen when we were in school, and that doesn't happen anymore. But certainly there are pieces of instruction that can be deemed no longer effective. But this really gives us an opportunity for staff to collaborate, to work together, to problem solve together, and it's hard to do that in isolation. The second piece of your question, Keith, really has to do with you know, how we stand up and how we stack and how we strategize in moving kids to a career path, a choice-ready path following graduation, whether it's going to be a career right away, military, or if it's going to be post-secondary education. And all of this plays into that. One of the conversations that we were having long before the pandemic and long before we were having a conversation about a referendum is our schools, in particular high schools, need to look differently internally for our students. Otherwise, they've got options, right? And they really know they've got options after this pandemic environment. We've had a virtual academy, and some students are doing super well in that, where they don't even come to campus, but they come to campus maybe for co or extracurricular activities. Well, because that has worked so well for some of our students, it's likely that we're going to have to offer that as a strand moving forward. The hybrid model at the high school level has worked super well for some of our students every other day. Hasn't worked really well for some of our other students, and that would not be a path that we'd want to put them on. That's really a really expensive model to operate. But we've looked at how we can cluster classes. Eric Ripley's, all of his 73 CTE courses, how those could be clustered with some of our common content, common core standards, and create different kind of tracks for students. So if they know at age 16 what they want to do or what they want to be in 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, or 15 years, we ought to be able to create those tracks for them internally. So we've got some opportunities there, and I hope I answered your question. Scott, you want to take a swing at that academic question?
Good job.
Anything that we should know, what you're hearing in the community, would be really important for us. You want to give us feedback today? Please do it at the microphone so everybody at home can hear you as well. Have you thought of, did you think of, are you crazy? Anything, all of the above. Sure.
I think the sustainability piece that you touched on is really important. Not being here in 15, or I think you said 40, but whatever time horizon, that's extremely important to focus on.
So for those of you at home, the feedback from the audience was, let's make sure that this plan is sustainable and that we're not back here again having this conversation, asking the public for more. Thank you, Keith. All right, well, seeing no other movement from the seats, let's give you a gift of time today and get you out of here early. Again, on behalf of both school boards and the entire school district, I want to thank you for participating today. Again, thanks to Keith Lund and Barry Wolfhart for putting this on, and a special thank you to Mayor Boczynski and City Administrator Todd Phelan for being here as well today. Thank you. Have a great evening.